Welcome everyone to the Pedesting Podcast. Pedesting Podcast is all about accessibility, urban design, architecture, and education. Today I'm pleased to be joined by Jamie Guidomo, who's a really well-respected ESG expert in the real estate community. Thank you, Jamie.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
I would like to get to understand your journey in the space. So you've led sustainability and ESG across massive portfolio. When you're thinking about that scale, what helps you make progress without losing the sight of the human experience helping to shape those respective spaces?
Yeah. So when you look at a portfolio scale or looking at buildings across the country, one of the things you try to do is what do buildings have in common? What are the categories? And within the social dimension, there were really we two main areas where we felt strongly that there was good information about what made a significant difference. One was health and well-being. And so we like the WELL standard. The FIT standard is good at understanding, the place of the building within a city or urban area, and then the types of features and amenities within the building, and then the type of service that you have. And we felt confident that our tenants, the occupants, notice the difference and that they place value on being on buildings that support health and well-being. We also felt that on accessibility, that this was a major area of the social dimension, which was, I think largely at a legal compliance or oftentimes not even at legal compliance standards. And most buildings were looking for guidance. Most teams were looking for guidance around what makes a difference. Of all the things that you can do, where can you make a difference? And so that led us on, a journey for a couple of years to try and understand better what those things are. And the other pieces of the social dimension get trickier when you get to like equity, social equity. You get to some of those and it becomes, the waters get a bit murkier as to what is the role of a building owner manager in those. It becomes more like that seems more like a city function than a building owner function.
Yeah, it was very tough to think about from a micro perspective. Like that for me, did you find that there was a particular type of space where a greater impact? Was it office alignment, retail alignment? What type of alignment do you feel like you were able to enhance the human experience?
I'll back up a second. I mean, I'm a parent of three daughters, 11, 9, and 2. And so I spent a lot of time in the last years pushing a stroller. And, I know that's not a disability, but it opens your lens a bit more to like, how do you travel through space? And there are beautiful spaces, but they're terrible to travel through. Like, so Simon Fraser University, the campus up on the hill, beautiful space, but there's a constant change. And with a stroller, it's difficult. And as a I can pull them upstairs, but even then it's difficult. And so I started noticing a lot more what makes spaces inviting and what makes spaces more challenging to access through physical barriers, but then also signage issues. And what I'd say is that retail spaces tend to be better. They're more familiar with a range of clientele and trying to provide access. They also, even when there are spaces that aren't very accessible, the staff that work there are very client focused. And there's a shopping center that had a space that you had to go down 5 stairs, and they knew that the space wasn't accessible. So when they saw someone coming up to it, they were proactive with saying, can we help you? Do you want us to do the shopping? Do you want us to help you down? How can we do this? And they were that was part of their culture. The retail culture, I think, is very aligned with accessibility. I think the next in office, I've noticed a lot of willingness, um, if framed properly. So where people get anxious about office is they think like, oh, they're going to force me to replace every bathroom door with an accessible door. Then they go off on a tirade about how expensive that's going to be and we can never do it. And you have to spend quite a bit of time to direct the conversation back to what are the things that have the most impact, and can we make sure that there are at least a handful of accessible washrooms? But is that the number one problem people are facing? What are the problems people are facing? Have we asked those questions? So instead of saying right away we can't afford it, let's actually ask our tenants, let's ask our occupants, what are the things that are important to them and where are they facing barriers and obstacles? And once we reframed the question like that, the office group became very interested in learning and improving.
So I think that's a very important aspect for really understanding who you're doing space for. And so I kind of really touch on this, but maybe you can maybe elaborate. I don't real estate leader from various sectors. So what kind of mindset or leadership qualities do you think that helps create that real momentum in this accessibility and improvement, and not just surface level items? So from your experience, besides listening, what other leadership quality would you say drive that and momentum?
So I think there are a few big drivers of momentum. Federal policy is a big one. So if you want the federal government as a tenant, and then the federally regulated entities, so banks being federally regulated entities, that cascade of regulation down through these key groups was kind of the biggest lever of going, we know this is going to have to happen. Now, do we want to do this at the most rational moments? So, hey, when we're doing a renovation or when we have control over this, or do we want to wait as long as possible and then there's going to be a really expensive, complicated thing? And secondly, do we want to tell tenants, prospective tenants, when we're leasing? When we're leasing, do we want to say, don't worry, when we need to be ready in 2040 or whenever the number is, we'll be ready? Or do we say, hey, accessibility is really important to us. If you move into this building, we'll partner with you to make sure that we understand your accessibility priorities, and we'll make the investments along the way. So I think that was one big one. Regulation is tenants. And then I think the other is we have experience with green certified buildings, so LEED certified buildings, Energy Star certified buildings. There's a fair amount of research that shows that those buildings financially perform better than buildings that aren't certified. The mechanism typically isn't a rent premium. It's not people are going to pay more for these buildings. It's that if you don't have these things, people might not choose your building, or they may negotiate more to go in your building. And we saw a similar logic with accessibility, where we said, hey, if we're trying to attract good tenants who themselves want to make sure that they can hire the best people are going to have all sorts of different abilities. If they want to attract the best people and those best people want to work productively in this building, what's it going to take? And if we can be proactive on accessibility, chances are we will do better at attracting the type of tenants we want. And that's worth a dollar investment. That's worth spending some money to make that happen.
That the great, as you were describing it, that got my way back for early in my career when I was job seeking. I wanted to identify with employees who are committed to making a space that feels welcoming and functional and it can be your best self. So I kind of want to kind of elaborate on that point that you just made, but the River Canton accessibility certification, or it doesn't have to be certification, but other technologies. So from your experience from all these programs and technologies, what tends to make them truly stick and be adopted? Highlights what helps create that true buy-in and being fully committed.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think LEED, there were a few things I felt led to LEED being widely adopted. The first is LEED really cultivated a deep followers who were deep believers. They they felt that LEED was going to change the world, and in many ways it did. Real estate is a very conservative space. Change is very difficult, and LEED has made not radical change, but like, hey, broadly across the board, tons of buildings are now 30-40% better. That's a huge accomplishment. They're not 100% better, but they're 30-40% better on environmental stuff. And they did it by really empowering people in the green community with, hey, you can do this. Their annual conferences were really about getting people to believe that their actions made a difference, that this was a movement that was successful, that was going to change the industry, and this was inevitable, and that, there's a tight, people felt an affinity to it. So I think there's really generating that positive, close, emotional thing is super important. I think the next was it was an inclusive community. It wasn't, they didn't say, you don't believe in net zero, you're not part of us. Anyone who was interested in doing something, they welcomed into the tent. And hey, maybe that something's not quite enough, but you're beginning your journey. Like, hey, let's bring you in so we understand what you can do at the beginning of your journey. And so I think there was that inclusive aspect, and where it wasn't accusing people of not doing enough. It was welcoming people, and in that welcoming, basically that encouraged people who were starting out to want to go further. They liked the community, they learned. So I think those, and then as we'd started taking off, started creating these kind of volume approaches. Hey, if you've got Bank of America did it, I think Starbucks did it, I did it at Bentall Kennedy, where we said, hey, these buildings aren't too different from one another. Instead of every time we want to certify a building, we have to go through this big process. Hey, the approach we take on creating a bank branch is very similar. So can we get the prototype approved? And we just kind of do this. And they were able to get a volume up. And so I did 50 office buildings, and it was, I probably saved 70-80% time cost by taking this prototype approach. And the policies were the same across the buildings, the typical process, the energy audits we went through, these different pieces were very similar, and that enabled us to go quickly through the certification process and spend more time and money on what are we going to do to improve. So the certification is really you've crossed a threshold, but crossing that, and you've got a bunch of information about how to go further. And so why don't we spend most of our effort on the going further portion? And I think that's the opportunity Rick Hansen has ahead of it with the certification program, is to make it easier and faster for people to go through a certification and to focus on what's your improvement plan? What does the next 5 years look like? And what are you going to put into your capital plan? What are you going to put into your operational plan? And that's to me where translating it into the language of asset managers, like you were an asset manager, just going, okay, tell me what's actually going in the capital plan. Then you know that you're having success.
Yeah, and I make some great points. So, it, yeah, like you describe how I create being engaged in the community that was super critical. I've been involved in some foundation from the early days of this expectation program over the last, 6, 7 years, and I feel like momentum has truly accelerated in the last 2, 3 years. So what do you think have attributed to the acceleration and momentum when it comes to certification? What do you think is driving owners to get certified by the can?
So I think a bit of competition. Cadillac Fairview is doing a great job. I know a range of firms are doing a great job. So there's a bit of competition. And then I think the other is the extent that tenants ask for it. So, if RBC asks for it, that's a big signal to the marketplace. If TD asks for it, that's a big signal to the marketplace. So the federal government asks for it. And those are the important signals. I think where Rick Hansen Foundation has been successful at helping big organizations start sending those signals into the marketplace.
That's great. So, I'm familiar with the certification process. So, the wayfinding is a component of it, and it sits at the intersection of accessibility and user experience. So, I know that you know a little bit about pedestrian, but what do you think tools like pedestrian fits into the broader ESG or building performance goals? How do you think technologies like pedestrian help elevate building performance?
Yeah, I think it's got a great place. When I was advising portfolios on this, it wasn't clear to me what good digital signage looked like or good digital wayfinding looked like. And, we had lots of recommendations around, we need to improve signage, we need to improve wayfinding. And I knew that, hey, from the different abilities people have, like some of it's got to be digital. You can't just have things up on walls from a vision perspective and other perspectives. So I'm like, okay. And it doesn't make sense for most owners to do that individually. Is like, because people are moving through space, they're moving through cities, they're moving through, and they don't want to have an app for Cadillac Fairview, an app for Bentall Green Oak, an app for this, and so I think it's the like, okay, how do building owners collaborate with Pedesting so that their customers, their tenants, their occupants can not just move through their space, but can move through the broader community. And I think that's what's exciting is that connecting people and solving something that individual buildings don't know how to solve.
Thank you for this contact from my user experience. I'm sure that you heard story with the time on the advisory committee at the council, but from a user perspective, I get really anxious about going out, not knowing what different phase I want to get there, or does the pick up and drop off look like? Simple things like that. So, possessing it meant to remove that barrier, but I'm feeling less anxious about going up. So, kind of, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that what how the certification process. I have asset owner, asset managers, and building owners build up the capital plans. So across the buildings that you work with, what kind of accessibility improvements have you seen that drive real impact or positive feedback from tenant representatives, and how the tools like Pedesting help make impact more visible and measurable. I already mentioned how there's a fear amongst almost every door has to be accessible. So from your experience, what have you found by having most impact, and how do you typically measure if it's impactful or not?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I would say that the property teams I've worked with have gone above and beyond. Like, I'm used to on sustainability, on health and safety, on environmental, but people are responsive, but they they often need a lot of nudging. And when we communicated out around, hey, there's some subsidies to do some audits through the Ontario government, with thanks to the Ontario government, there was an overwhelming response to do this. And then once they saw the results, there's an overwhelming response to fix a few things and to get certified. Uh, and I think that the accessibility and the Rick Hansen certification really lined up with values. And I've been extremely fortunate to work at companies that are very values aligned and have amazing people, but they really went above and beyond. And I think in the early days, really the actions were smaller things from a capital perspective. It was about parking spaces. Most buildings didn't have accessibility parking spaces properly indicated. Most, if any, didn't have pathways from the accessibility parking space marked into the building. What's a safe passage from that space into the building? Those were kind of the big initial ones. We had another where unfortunately the building didn't, they were doing a bigger renovation. They didn't have an assessment done. They put in a bunch of external landscaping only to get the municipality to say this landscaping isn't accessibility compatible. And so they basically, it cost them a lot of money to have to dig that up and put in accessible space. But we used it, thankfully, the people who ran the building weren't too embarrassed, and they used it as an example internally to go, hey, we made a mistake so that you don't make a mistake. Basically, all of the projects that have landscaping or have significant changes to lobbies, it makes a lot of sense to have an assessment done ahead of time, because you can't, the landscape architect, the architects aren't necessarily looking at this in the way they should, and they need external support. So I think that those were the main areas. I think the next was getting awareness up around any renovations. So, kind of a year ahead of doing any significant renovations, what made sense, not just from a current legal standard in that jurisdiction, but what made sense from a Rick Hansen certified and from a federal. So getting people to look at both those as well, and then making calls there.
When you were talking about the growth about and how you were able to achieve 70% cost savings by coming up with some templates for attacks that could duplicate things. So, have you ever come across coming up with a template when it comes to accessibility that really help scale and really drive cost savings when you're encouraging when that renovation process is happening? Have you ever developed, playbook
Yes.
or template?
So that was the intention. So there was a report that Rick Hansen came out with recently, I think last year, around office space and improving accessibility within office spaces. And the intention of that report was to understand changes to a building from the life cycle stage. What should you focus on if the building isn't built yet? What should you focus on if you're going to lease a space or if you're in a space? But really, as a tenant, what should you ask for? If you're a tenant and you're looking to lease an office space, what are the questions you should ask? What are the features you should look for? And then if you're fitting out your space, what's that look like? And so guide was an attempt to come up with a shorter list of what are the key things that should be done. We hadn't taken it to the level of, okay, now let's abstract this up and roll it out across all the buildings. But that's, I think, what leading owners of office buildings should do, is basically take that office guide and use it as the priority list for improvements.
Yeah, another thing I'm grateful that the foundation does to create somewhat valuable resources and push it out to industry. Wonderful to see that. So I know I talked about this in the context of federal governments or industries that are regulated like banks, but have you come across any building where accessibility improvements were the clear return on investment or the higher tenant satisfaction, leasing value? Have there been any case studies that help them make a real financial case for accessibility improvement?
Yeah, I think we're hard to come up with a definitive financial case study, but definitely, views. There's a view in institutional real estate, so pension-backed real estate, that the price that someone's willing to pay for a building is discounted if there are liabilities. So the challenge is how visible are those liabilities? And so, you think of if you have an office building that, let's say only 20% of the space is accessible. Most of the washrooms are not accessible. Even a lot of the openings to office spaces aren't accessible. That will someone who buys that building, will they discount the purchase price because they realize like the big banks will never move in here, the tech companies will never move in here, the federal government will never move in here. So, hey, chances are future rent in this building is not going to achieve top of market. So that's the general thinking, but I haven't seen actual write downs in valuations, but I think that's coming. The closer we get to regulated, the more we're going to see that appear.
Well, I hope you're wrong and you're right at the same time. I hope you're wrong. Because I hate to see a depressed real estate market, but I hope you're right that it's one of the levers that continues those spaces.
I think we're in an interesting moment because in a depressed real estate market, a lot of owners don't want to spend money, but it's a renter's market, and a renter's market, they pick buildings that perform better. And so if you don't offer these amenities, people just aren't going to choose your building. And so the smart owners are the ones who are looking ahead and going, yeah, I want this building to be leased. I know that there are things I need to spend money on to make sure I get there. And in a tighter real estate market, you can't just count on everything being leased. I think that's one of the things in Canada over the last 20 years is occupancy rates have been so high that many building owners are just like, it doesn't matter. Whatever I put out there is going to get leased. And that's not the case anymore. So you're going to have to spend some money if you want your building to perform better. And the market is going to get smarter.
And no, as I was describing that, I was thinking about the Calgary market, where, the vacancy rate, kind of hovering around the range anywhere from 25 to 30% vacancy. but it's so amazing work with building owners or on the pedestrian platform. We'll see that on the term value and what we're trying to achieve. So I was kind of want to elaborate and build a good split with ESG framework. And do you think accessibility is getting the attention that it deserves? And what do you think will help elevate it alongside other building performance metrics like carbon capture or energy efficiency? What, Freya, maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
I feel strongly that accessibility is not getting enough consideration within ESG. Most real estate companies, when they talk about ESG, they don't talk about accessibility. And I think that's a major gap. And I hope that the recognition improves significantly. You do have leaders, and there are a number of them in Canada, and you're helping a significant Calgary marketplace. But when I look at the States, this is not something that we see in the majority of Canadian real estate companies. This is not what we see. And I think it really needs more awareness. And so whether that's lobbying GRESB or the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, that accessibility needs to have a higher weighting in there. And then I think also the working with the big tenants, the more that big companies ask for this, and maybe they don't even demand it, but just even getting the big tenants to have a standard set of questions. And so they know this is considered, that I think will suddenly elevate accessibility up within the framework, within people's priorities.
So, well, I have a few more questions for you. So, from a design and navigation perspective, what do you think building upon for today? Uh, what could you do to make more space more intuitive, usable, especially with people with disability or anybody who might not be familiar with that space?
Yeah, I think one of the tensions in buildings is more signage would be helpful, but buildings often don't want to look cluttered. And so I think that's a big opportunity for the digital space around, both on an app or, sort of using GPS type stuff. And I think that the virtual signage and virtual navigation is the key to it, because I think the wayfinding is a losing battle of trying to just put up more and more visual things around the building. And so different ways, audio ways that people can get cues and, to your point, can understand ahead of time so they can plan their journey. Understanding that it makes a huge difference. And I think the Pedesting has a bright future in, I could see, Toronto, once you're mature and you've expanded, Toronto would love that platform, and building
Yeah,
owners in Toronto would love that platform.
especially with that complicated pass system. Every time I'm in downtown, talking about I get lost, I get lost in the pass system.
It's complicated as a pedestrian, let alone someone who's got different needs, and whether it's, not just accessibility, but like sound levels. I mean, some people
Yeah,
get very stressed with like, okay, what, food courts can be there's a lot of stimuli. And it's like, okay, how do I navigate here without going through places that have like so much noise and stimulation that people end their journey?
yeah, and I've been to part of the pass system where they have a platform lift. I go up a few stairs that require a key to operate. So yeah, we can't wait to expand the other markets across Canada. What advice would you give
Oh,
the next leaders who want to build more inclusive and thoughtful environments? What advice would you give them?
so the first piece of advice I'd give is to, spend some time to understand the language of real estate owners, investors, managers. I find that to be effective, you really have to understand their world, their logic, their language. And it's really around like, okay, and once you understand their world a bit, then it's translating what are you trying to achieve into their language and their levers. What does success look like for them? And I think that's my advice often is you need to understand the other person better to you to be able to move forward.
That was great. That was great telling because I was just going to say thank you so much, Jamie, for your time today. And think insight with our audience. I hope this inspires people in the industry to get engaged, to create a community, and hopefully make it more accessible. Thank you so much, Jenny, for your time. Can't wait to see how the street evolves for the next 3 years. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate the conversation.